So this is Theresa Cho. Theresa was one of my first students in our first cohort, and was the first one to graduate with with the Doctor of Ministry through the adaptive leading change process. And so I'm glad to introduce Theresa to the class. And Theresa and I are both Presbyterians, and we have this great connection. Theresa is the pastor of St. John's Presbyterian Church in San Francisco. So Theresa, thank you for being with our class.
Oh, it's great. I don't get to see any of them, but it's great to be with you all.
I know, I was hoping that you that we would actually do something where you'd actually get to be with them, but at least you get to speak into it. So Theresa, you and I have chatted just a brief bit about this whole conversation around adaptive change and discipleship. I also want you to reflect on the way in which you see those things working out today, both in your congregation and in the larger church around these issues of race. You and I have talked a lot about that, and your congregation really, your own project was really about the sense of self-identity, kind of racial identity, personal identity, pastoral identity. So when you hear me talk about adaptive change and discipleship from your own perspective, what comes to mind for you?
Well, what comes to mind to me is, yeah, that's my life. I grew up, I feel like the moment I was born, because my parents came from South Korea. And in the 70s, when they came, it was all about this fast-paced assimilation, making your children be as, in their eyes, as American as possible. So I just grew up constantly observing people, constantly assessing my situation and adapting, for good or for bad, my behavior, my attitude, my thoughts to my surroundings. And they were always changing. So in some ways, when I hear about adaptive language, I just feel like, oh gosh, I've been doing this my whole entire life. How to translate that to a congregation or any organization, then that's the challenge.
Yeah. Tell a little bit about your congregation. It's an interesting group of folk in an interesting place. Yeah.
Yeah, currently, we're not a very large congregation. We worship about 50 to 80 when we were worshiping face-to-face. We just celebrated our 150 years of existence. It is a congregation, though, that has moved. So in its 150 years, we're at the third location. And it's interesting. It started out like this pastor just said, one day out on the sand beach dunes out there, there's going to be a neighborhood. And so we should plant a church there. So St. John's was one of the first things planted in the neighborhood. And that really is that DNA that kind of carries over, is this risk to be daring and confident. What's interesting is what also carries on in the DNA is that first pastor was originally kicked out from a previous church because he was all for the Civil War. It's 150 years worth of history to kind of then lead them to a place where now they really are open to looking at our neighborhood and our community and saying, yeah, let's try it, let's do it. And so we become very intergenerational, very interracial, and which is wonderful and brings its own challenges.
Hey, can you tell a little bit about the story about how you were hired to help reach the Chinese American part of the community?
Such a fun story. Yeah, so I was hired as an associate pastor 17 years ago at St. John's, and it was all over their mission study. And the mission study is really where they study the neighborhood and they look at their church and they pair their mission and vision to then the demographics of the neighborhood. And they're like, gosh, there's a lot of Chinese American families moving into our neighborhood. We should hire an associate pastor that looks like them so that we can attract all of these Chinese American families. So that's really what I got hired to do. It was unbeknownst to me, though. I saw it in their mission study, but my head of staff did not put that upon me. What also I didn't know was there was only 3 years of funding. So I had 3 years to bring in this population and grow the church in a very specific way. And so by my second year, you could tell that the church was very anxious because the funding was drying up and there weren't Chinese American families flocking to our church. A part of the realization was that they hired a Korean American to do that. But then the other part is, again, it's a race issue. This was an elderly white, mostly white congregation. This is how they thought they could solve their problem,
Yeah.
without thinking about what that would do to their congregation, and knowing that they did it before. And so I had to dig through the history and uncover this tidbit where they did hire a Chinese American pastor earlier on, and he was successful at it. And 16 months later, they fired him.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I love your project was that it really is about a group of people who mean well, but they do a technical solution that when you look back on it, you cringe. They hired a Korean American woman to reach Chinese Americans. Like, the blinders are just so huge. And partly what I love about it is how you have been a person who has had to disappoint them and take them through a process where today they are much more inclusive and open than they ever could be. So tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, what's so funny is we are what I think they envisioned themselves to be when they hired me. And yet we didn't go about it the way that they thought it was going to happen. And a part of it was really not looking at what kind of people were in the neighborhood, but really who was just walking through our doors. I mean, San Francisco is not a religious city. And so for anybody to walk through the doors is not only a risk on their part, but it's intentional. And so for us, it was really looking at all these people who are walking through our doors and why were they not staying, and assessing that. And it turned out a lot of it had to do with our behavior. And so for us, it turns out a lot of families were coming through. And so what was it about us when we said we were welcoming and hospitable? I mean, it was on the bulletin. What was it that that didn't translate to them? And so I think then that's where some of the technical changes came through, but not as a fix, but more as an experiment, a study, a testing of the hypothesis, if you will. And it was in that we were having to reflect on our own behavior and change our behavior first, not their behavior.
And you were doing your own work about your own sense of identity at the same time, right? This was part of your own exploration.
Yeah, well, because I wasn't doing this because I felt called to be a pastor. I was doing it because my previous occupation was I was a teacher for children with autism. So I was like, okay, this is my wheelhouse. I put together, an IEP. I put together like what I did as a teacher. I created a behavior plan for them because there were behaviors that came out as we were doing stuff, and that's how I worked it. And so then as the years were going by, and really my internal sense of call was really being tested, I didn't realize how much I had also changed because I was so focused on their change. I just overlooked how much I was changing as well. Yeah.
So when you think about, the subject matter for this year is thinking about how we develop the capacity of our people to change and how that parallels the notion of the transformation we have to have as people who follow Jesus. So as you think about the notion about what it takes, like where does discipleship and where does adaptive leadership capacity come together for you? What are some of the practices? What are some of the processes? What are some of the things that you do as a pastor to develop that help this congregation go from being so completely blinded and to the place where they are really a genuinely open community today and hospitable community today?
Well, I think we often look at, adaptive change, and this may be an assumption, but really towards the outside of our church. Like, okay, so what do we need to change internally? But it's really because we want to grow the church and be bigger. When it's really more than that, because I will say we've changed so much over the years, but we haven't changed in size at all.
Yeah.
So for me, then, discipleship has less to do with, going out there and bringing people in, and it more has to do with really my personal understanding of my own faith. One of the examples that we did with my church was looking at Walter Brueggemann's idea of Sabbath. That, Sabbath sounds so understandable. We rest on the seventh day. You all should rest. We all work too hard. Our work ethic is, through the roof. But Brueggemann actually talks about it stopping a pattern, stopping a cycle, stopping a habit, and also remembering why that cycle began. And so for Sabbath, it was that, they, in the midst of slavery in Egypt, they never rested, and they worked because they had to build a quota, from a pharaoh who was dictating them. And so Sabbath then is remembering that this is a God who saved him from that, but that we are never to enter into that again. Because according to Brueggemann, prosperity breeds amnesia. And so once we're prosperous, we will pull other people into that same cycle. So it's the same thing as the church. It's like there is a cycle